before any form of awakening, and there were many forms before I ever found psychedelics. I was pretty lost. I grew up as a child of divorced parents, and I was exposed to what we would now call early childhood trauma, although obviously at the time it had no functional meaning to me. But my mom was mentally ill. I had only one parent. We were living on the poverty line. I did not feel safe physically or emotionally. There were incidences of my mom dating men who would come in when my sister and I were young, and situations that were not totally cool. But I think when you're a kid, you normalize whatever your situation is. So it never occurred to me that I was living something divergent or inappropriate. This was just life. As a result of this upbringing and without any consciousness around it, I ended up very angry. I was a very angry young lady. I acted out in school. I acted out through my teens. I had virtually no emotional self regulation. I would get triggered by the slightest things and find myself yelling, crying, throwing things, storming out of places, with no pause between the thought and the action. There was no space inside my head to understand that I could even make another choice. I couldn't have made another choice. That was the only reaction I knew how to lean into. I was scared all the time, and I think that constant underlying fear, because I didn't grow up with a feeling of physical or emotional safety. I think that underlying fear is what drove a lot of the anger. Because my other option was to turn into like just a crying puddle of vulnerability, which I chose that route too sometimes. But anger felt safer. It felt like I was more in control, like I could push off the negative emotions as opposed to allow them to subsume me. Before any form of awakening, and there were many forms before I ever found psychedelics, I was pretty lost. In navigating life in a way that I noticed wasn't the way a lot of other people did it, it didn't occur to me that I was acting out of impulses that, psychologically are normal, because I didn't have a framework for it. So for me, I always thought it was me. I must be broken. There must be something wrong with me. I must lack compassion or capacity or some kind of essential emotional thing that other people seemed to have that I just didn't feel inside me. So I fell backwards into different modalities pretty much by accident. I think yoga was probably the first place that I found myself where I started experiencing some kind of mental, emotional, and physical opening. I found myself often in yoga classes crying for no reason. I had no understanding that it was some kind of somatic release. I just would be crying. And so yoga was actually what led me deeper into other places of self exploration. I landed in a yoga retreat with a instructor who I'd been following for many years. And he and I were talking privately, and he recommended that I attend a Vipassana meditation retreat. So those are 12-day silent retreats where you're segregated, there's no eye contact, there's no physical contact. You eat very sparsely, you meditate for roughly 12 hours a day. There's some Dharma talks, but you're silent during them. Your keys are taken away, your books are taken away. It's a completely interior experience. I took this instructor's recommendation to heart, and so on my 40th birthday, I booked myself into a Vipassana meditation retreat. I was amazed at all we were doing was sitting in silence, and what was happening was all this rage was arising. I was so angry. And then all these scenarios were coming through my head of all the terrible things that were happening at home because I was disconnected from life. I couldn't use my phone, I couldn't use a computer, I couldn't contact anyone, and I had this full belief that my husband was going to leave me, that like my life was falling apart, that my business, I don't know, I just kept telling myself these crazy stories. And finally on the fifth or sixth day, I made an appointment with the instructor, and I said, I need to go. Like, I can't stay here any longer. And he didn't know me, and he was trying to find some kind of like emotional hook to make me stay. You know, he would say, well, what are your children going to think if you quit halfway through? And I was like, I don't care what my children are going to think. And he kept trying to find ways to make me stay, and it wasn't working. And he finally said, fine, you can go. And I like, to this day, I can feel the wash of relief that ran through my body because I knew I was getting my car keys back. So I stood up to go, and he said to me, but you know what your problem is? And I'm like, you can tell me what my problem is. No problem. I'm out of here. And he said, your problem is you're addicted to your misery. And that hit so true for me. It brought to mind for me what my mother had lived throughout the years of her mental instability. It was just the first time that I felt somebody had nailed the truth of my experience. So I sat back down. Shortly after that, I was telling a friend of mine about this experience, and she invited me to join a circle that she was part of conscious women who were using MDMA as a way to um, slough off their childhood wounds and reconnect to something wholer and fuller. And I was petrified. I grew up during the war on drugs. I had never really touched any hard drugs. You know, I smoked pot, but other than that, I every other psychedelic to me was something that like you would throw yourself out of a window or jump off of a building or your brain would melt or I don't know what. And when she told me about it, I was really scared, but I trusted her. So I allowed myself to go into this group of women. I took half a dose because I was afraid of what a full dose would do. And then I re upped about 2 hours later and took the full dose. I remember sitting and just feeling love, right? Like just being able to sit in a spot where suddenly all the noise and all the voices in my head and all the judgments and all the stories just weren't there. The only thing that was there was what was there. It was the moment and the surroundings and this incredibly supportive group of people who were really just exploring the capacity of what it's like to be human in this world. I sat in those circles for probably 5 or 6 years and continued to let go of a lot of the old stories I had continuously told myself and slowly started to look inwards and acknowledge the wounds and my shadow and the things I'd been ignoring. And it was that experience, it was that groundwork, I would say, that ultimately led me to want to try a larger dose and more intensive psychedelic experience that would potentially allow me to break through as opposed to um, chip around the edges. MDMA is a great modality as a beginner to soften your heart, to get into a space of altered reality, but without totally losing yourself. I got to a stage in my own personal development when I realized that I was still standing in my own way, and the only way to do that would be to go beyond the boundaries and the limitations that my head wouldn't let me get through, which is why I decided to explore with psilocybin. I had arranged for a facilitated and psilocybin experience that was good, but it didn't take me really deep. So shortly after that, I decided to create an experience for myself. I had taken myself off to sort of a cabin in the woods and had prepared a psilocybin decoction. I took a tea, and at the time, I think I took just over 2 grams. It was October, and it was beautiful outside. The leaves were changing. I was looking out over a lake. There were trees and birds and all kinds of nature. Aside from just the joy that the experience opened up in me, it's what finally let me see past myself into the world, the bigger world, and recognize how beautiful it was. I probably spent 2 hours just crying, sobbing, because I was so overwhelmed and in awe of the magnificence of the world that we were in, and the fact that I had never seen it that way before, that I'd lived like over 40 years of life, and I had never I never knew how beautiful it was. That kind of changes you forever, because once you know that, you can't ever stop knowing that. And even when I was back in my regular state of mind, whatever that means, I was altered. I never really went back to I guess lost or meandering feelings or thoughts. I was always able to tap back into that place and recognize that it's always here. The trees didn't change, the sun didn't change, the water was still there. If we just understand that, like, it's almost impossible not to live life in a constant state of awe. That realization was a was a huge game changer for me, because I had spent so much of my life doing the opposite, finding the negative, being angry, being scared, being um, negative, finding what was wrong in life, leaning into depression and sorrow and anxiety. And when I was able to abstract from all of that and realize that it was possible to feel joy for no damn reason, it was like the key to the kingdom. Like suddenly it was like I can just I can just choose to feel this way. Psychedelics, in my experience, both personal experience and professional experience, is that it's not a magic pill. It's not like you take a psychedelic once and you're suddenly healed and transformed. What they do, or what they did for me, was open up a door that had always been closed. Psychedelics allowed me to start looking at parts of myself that I had repressed, that I had shamed, that I didn't want to admit to, that I was embarrassed about, that caused me fear or sorrow. They gave me a space between looking at that and reacting to it, so that I can begin to process a lot of those childhood wounds. Was I cured? Do psychedelics cure you? Not in my experience. Do they put you on the path to healing? Absolutely. Without my psychedelic experiences, there's no way I would have had the courage to um, start doing the real work that allowed me to look at myself, to start acknowledging the pain that I was walking around with, to recognize that so much of the pain came from um, wounds that I didn't even want to admit that I had. They allow me to lean into vulnerability as a strength rather than a weakness. They allowed me to start doing somatic healing, to realize that if I can allow things to move out of my body in a more physical way, then I can actually heal more than just trying to talk things out or be constantly in my head. Um, they put me in full touch with an experiential reality that I never would have accessed, I believe, without them. Um, and as a result, my work with psychedelics has allowed me to truly start healing the parts of myself that were um, wounded, and to recognize that I was never broken, that that none of us are ever broken. We're just we're just sometimes lost. it's not just an intellectual exercise where you journal and change habits and talk about it and write about it. It's actually a physical exercise. That integration is literally a full acceptance of all the emotions that are arising within you into your body. It is, you integrate the broken pieces, you take them and you put them back into the spots in your, I don't know, chakra, energy fuel, whatever, where they were leaking out, and you pull them back in. And it's not a band-aid and it's not a plugging the hole. It's just a return of a balance that I guess we all lose when we navigate life, because, because that's what life does. I know that if today I ran into the woman I was 20 years ago, I wouldn't recognize her. I would have compassion. I do have compassion for her. I even love her. But she's not who I am. Even 10 years ago, the overall impact that psychedelics have had in my life is that they have accelerated my path towards self-awareness. They have given me a tool towards true consciousness that has nothing to do with some intellectual storytelling and everything to do with leaning more deeply into my authenticity. This is a tool that can help regular people find peace and joy and equilibrium.